Work Besties, welcome to our new series called Work Bestie Business. It's where we discuss topics that many of us face within our working lives, but we have more of a casual conversation about it. Maybe you learn something new through this series. Maybe you feel seen. Maybe you find different ways to work around situations that you're facing at work. I really want this series to feel like we're on FaceTime, almost, like we're having a conversation about some harder stuff that perhaps we're experiencing or have experienced at work. I'm gonna share with you what I've learned on various topics. I'm gonna share some of my own experiences within these things that have happened with my working life and in my career and in my personal life in general. I hope you enjoy it. So we're gonna kick it off with this first episode being all about burnout. Dun, 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 which is a big word and a scary word and an intimidating word and something that I feel like deserves a lot of attention because majority of us, if not all of us, have either faced it or will face it at some point in our career. So first, let's define what burnout is. So burnout is a state of emotional, physical, and or mental exhaustion caused by excessive and prolonged stress. I'm reading off my notes here. I did a lot of research for this one because I wanted to make sure that I was incorporating my own lived experiences, but also, more study-based research and different perspectives on burnout. So if you see me looking at the screen, that's what I'm doing. I'm just reviewing my notes. The World Health Organization classifies burnout as an occupational phenomenon and not a medical condition. And it results from workplace stress that has not been successfully managed, is what they've said. Different characterizations of burnout can look like exhaustion, feelings of energy depletion, negativity, cynicism, distance from one's job, reduced efficiency in the workplace, which I know many of us can relate to. So that is the technical definition of it, how it is defined. But at the end of the day, burnout can and will affect everyone and anyone who works. And there's very few people that I know that I've met that have not experienced burnout in some capacity at some point in their careers. What I found really interesting about burnout is it's a specific to the workplace phenomenon and not necessarily something that can be used to describe other areas of life as per the World Health Organization. And so it's work specific, which is interesting because especially in the last, 5-6 years when we were going through the pandemic, I was just feeling this life burnout is what I've referred to it as. I guess it was just life exhaustion, I'm not too sure, but I feel like that idea of burnout, when you kind of focus it into a job, it gives it a lot less overwhelming power within your life because you can really kind of pinpoint it to work, that specific area. So I guess I found some relief in knowing that. Some characteristics or symptoms of burnout that I have found online, and many of these I can relate to, it's the loss of motivation, reduced productivity, feelings of helplessness, hopelessness, feelings of cynicism, restfulness, loss of energy, weakened immunity system. So it doesn't just impact you emotionally, it absolutely impacts you physically as well. Changes in appetite, disrupted sleep, self-doubt, negativity, isolation, procrastination, substance abuse or coping mechanisms, irritability, and shrinking of responsibility. So that's quite a long list. And what was interesting when I was looking at the symptoms and how they can kind of manifest in one's life is they are kind of closely related to depression, like major depressive disorder, depression, which is interesting because it can be potentially hard to differentiate what might be depression for those who struggle from that and what might be burnout, which specifically root cause would be the work element of your life. So let's get into the 4 different kinds of burnout that have been identified. The first one being overload burnout. So this is when you are so determined to reach a level of success that you are overworking yourself, you are overexerting yourself, you are disregarding every area of your life and pouring everything into work to reach this definition of success, however you deem that for yourself, and that can lead to overload burnout. So that's type 1. Type 2 is under challenge burnout. So this, and we're going to get a little bit further into this type in episode 2 when we talk about bore out, but this is the under challenged burnout, which is basically your work is boring, it's mentally not very stimulating, there's a feeling of underappreciation, lack of growth opportunities, of responsibilities, you're kind of lacking a sense of purpose. We're gonna get deep into that one in episode 2. Number 3 is neglect burnout. This is feelings of incompetency, helplessness when managing your responsibilities. There's been theories that it can be tightly connected to imposter syndrome, so not really feeling like you deserve to be somewhere, like you're an imposter in a room or in a job. And the 4th kind would be habitual burnout, where you are just chronically physically and mentally depleted, fatigued, and that just overwhelms every aspect of your life, and specifically work. You just can't seem to pull yourself out of this exhaustion to your core. So it's important in this conversation to take note of the difference between stress and burnout. Stress is linked to this idea of too much. It's too much going on, it's too overwhelming, I'm too overloaded, versus burnout is more tied to not enough. Stress might manifest itself as very hyper overreactive to things and constantly like go, 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 versus burnout looks more disengaged. Lack of wanting to be involved in things, potentially super bored, potentially lack of motivation, that kind of feeling. Because stress on one hand, at least certain kinds of it, can be very productive and very motivating and not necessarily have bad impacts on you, versus burnout in its whole is no good. It's no bueno. It's not fun. It's something that you definitely want to combat. It's something that we want to get ahead of. We want to identify it. We want to learn more about it. I've yet to hear at least of a good kind of burnout. I really don't think that one exists. But stress, there's multiple different kinds of stress, and some of them are actually quite good for us. So what causes burnout? Like how do we get burnt out? I've always been curious about this because I think how each of us gets burnt out is going to be so unique and so individual for each of us, because we're all wildly different, and what we need doesn't look like what the person who sits next to us at work or the person on the other side of that meeting, what they need at work, right? So a couple things that potentially could cause work-related burnout, and maybe as we go through that list, you're like, oh, well, that kind of sounds familiar. So what led you to a point of burnout? So it could be a lack of autonomy or control over your work, never really feeling like your work is your own to do. Maybe you're being micromanaged, or maybe you just don't have a lot of trust from your manager, or some things like that. High stakes environment, so a lot of deadline pressure, maybe unrealistic deadlines. You constantly feel behind, but you were set up to never even reach the finish line because the expectations were set so blindly, if you will, or so unrealistic. Work that is boring, not mentally stimulating, that is one that rings true really well for me in my experience with burnout. And episode 2, when we talk about bore out, we're gonna get a little bit deeper into that. Or another cause could be no positive feedback. So never really feeling appreciated, never getting credit for your work, never feeling like what you're doing is good enough. There's lack of work-life balance. So when your whole life, so much of it is consumed in one specific thing, aka work, and you lack all the other areas of life, that can really contribute to leading to burnout. I've seen that time and time and time again. Overwhelming workload responsibilities kind of ties into the deadlines, the pressure, never feeling like you can get as much done. Unfair treatment at work. So if you are not being treated fairly, you have coworkers, managers who just don't treat you with the respect that you deserve. You don't feel psychologically safe in the environment in which you work in. That could be a huge contributor to burnout as well. And then there's like the contributing factors to burnout, because as we said, burnout is a work-specific phenomenon. And so things that can contribute to it would be lack of sleep. So while sleep isn't necessarily part of your workday, we all know we require good sleep and an amount of rest in order to show up and do our job. Lack of non-work related socialization or activities, so that isolation piece can be really big when it comes to contributing to burnout. And then lack of support, and we're talking about lack of support personally, and we're also talking about it professionally as a contributing factor. So when you just don't feel overly supported in your life in multiple areas, that can often contribute to burnout as well. I'm not gonna sit here and pretend I'm an expert on burnout by any means. I've done a lot of research on the topic so that we can open this discussion, but again, not an expert in the field. But if there's one thing that I have learned about burnout throughout my career, it's that it's not failure. It doesn't signify weakness. I think there's this poor stigma around burnout that it's like, oh, if you burnt out, then you're just too weak for the environment. And that is so bizarre to me, because it doesn't signify that whatsoever. And there are very few people I know, and I'm talking about very successful people, that have not experienced burnout in some capacity. And I would be rather shocked if there's someone even watching this that's like, I've never experienced any amount of burnout, because the amount of burnout we can experience can be from a couple different days, weeks, to like years and years and years and years of recovery. So the spectrum in which burnout can exist is quite large. If anyone's watching and they're like, I have never experienced burnout, not yet. Not yet, you haven't. I think if you work, you experience burnout in some sort of capacity. And so it's not a signifier that you're weak or that you can't do things. So give yourself the grace to be like, this is a normal part of working experience, even though I wish it wasn't. It is. And it's more, at least when I've been burnt out in the past, it kind of gave me an opportunity to realize that one, something had to change because it feels awful and it sucks, and no one wants to show up to a job that they're bored in or disengaged in, or just makes them miserable. It kind of gave myself the opportunity, this space to reevaluate what was going on in my life, what external or personal factors were contributing to it, what the work environment was doing to contribute to it, what the actual work itself was doing, and then gave me an opportunity to go, okay, well, how can I change this? Because there's a lot of things in our working life that we just don't have control over. And there's a lot of things in our working life we do have control over, whether we realize it or not. And so it gave me an opportunity to be like, what can I change? How can I bring a little bit more spark or creativity or, passion into my job just to make it more enjoyable? Not for the company, but for me, myself. At the end of the day, I like to look at being burnt out as kind of an opportunity to reevaluate your priorities and potentially an opportunity for self-discovery, to figure out how burnout impacts you, to figure out what kind of things in an environment impact you more than you maybe potentially realize that they did in the past. While there's no magic rule book or step-by-step guide for how to deal with burnout, because like I said, it's so different for each of us, and what the root cause of or contributors, causes for what's burning us out are going to be so different person to person. There's a couple different things that we could potentially try. As we go through these, I also want you to remember that oftentimes we think, okay, I have to show up for work and I have to give 100% or I'm going to get fired. And it's important to remind yourself, if you only have 60% in your tank one day and you give 60%, you're giving 100% of what you have to work that day, aside from everything else going on in your life too that might require some of that percentage. And so I want you to just realize you only have as much to give as what you have available in your cup. And so when we're dealing with burnout and these types of things, we want to think about what could potentially refill our cup. Because as we said earlier, burnout isn't about too much, it's about not enough, which for me has kind of changed my whole perception about burnout, because rest and everything can be really helpful for some people when they're experiencing burnout. When I've experienced it in the past, it was actually that not enough, and I needed to add different things in order for me to get through that and start to address the root causes of where my burnout was coming from. When you recognize that, hey, maybe I might be burnt out, take a pause to recognize the symptoms that you're experiencing, recognize what's in your control and then what's also outside of your control, and then pivot, for lack of a better word, if you will, because that is corporate's favorite word, I feel like, is a good old pivot. And so it's, how can you change your current situation? How can you change the negative stimuli that are going on within your work life? Talking to people, especially on topics like burnout, even though they are a little bit taboo, and I hope eventually they're not. It's important to talk to other people to realize, one, you're not alone in experiencing burnout, but two, potentially to get some ideas or insights of what's helped other people in the past, or what potentially other people have experienced or integrated that you can integrate into your life to potentially change things up a bit. And then when you are burnt out, it's really more so than ever important to focus on the basic things in life that are able to support you in everything you do, but also contribute to having a successful work life, which, the basics: getting your body moving, make sure you're eating to nourish your body, sleeping well, drinking enough water, like really stripping it back, focus on the basics so that you're giving yourself a baseline setup of success to be able to lift yourself up and apply during your work life. Being burnt out in the past, it's this kind of reminder to check in with, like, how are the basics? Like, how am I taking care of myself at a human level so that I can show up to all the different areas of my life? And then also looking at the work isolated to go, okay, what areas in here, where am I really feeling friction? What's contributing to this feeling that I'm experiencing right now? What's in my control? What's not in my control? And in doing that exercise of just recognizing, without necessarily needing to identify that as the issue and I need to fix it, blah, 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 just take a pause and identify it. That's all you need to do at the start. And once you start to identify the things, then step two, be like, okay, what within here can I change? What's in my control? What actions can I take to sprinkle a little bit more in certain areas? I'll never forget, I actually took a couple months unpaid leave off of work to go do a training course down in Indonesia. And I was at this training, and I was at a point in my life where I was kind of unsure about work. I was losing a lot of my, excitement or passion. I was feeling quite bored. I would say I was at the early stages of burnout, and I remember talking to this teacher that had come to this training, this guru, if you will, and I was talking to this gentleman about, how can I re-spark interest in career? Like, what do I need to do? Where do I need to go? What should I apply for? And he kind of stopped me and he's like, well, have you thought about changing the way that you view your current situation? Have you thought about changing your perspective first towards the existing role that you have and seeing if there is a way that you can find a path within that will fulfill whatever you're looking for? And I was like, no, of course not, because it just seems easier to leave and to change and to just throw yourself in something new and then all your problems will be solved, right? At first I was kind of like, well, that seems like a little bogus response. What do you mean change my perspective? Like, work is work. Like, yeah, it's the job I signed up to do. And then when I really started thinking about it, I was like, okay, yes, this piece of my job is necessary, but it's really, really bumming me out and it's boring and it's repetitive and it's the bulk of the work I'm doing right now. But there's this tiny portion of work that I am involved in that I actually quite like and really uses a lot of my creativity and I feel like I'm strong at it. What if I potentially shift a little bit more of my focus into that and the other stuff just become, the part of the job? But if I really channel my energy into this one area, see potentially if I can expand that would make my work more interesting. I would be more engaged in it, sure. I started to think, well, what do I like about my job? I really like the people. Absolutely love the people that I was working with. When I started to identify the things that filled my cup during the day versus what depleted it, I started going, okay, well, maybe I need to focus on having more informal conversations with my coworkers to just keep building relationship, get really into this creative work that I'm doing and try to reduce how much time I'm spending on this more boring admin work, or sit down with my manager and see if there's a way I can shift to doing the creative stuff more full time and see if I can offload some of the other work. There was actually a way I was able to at least take steps and control what I could or try to control the situation to try to shift what I was experiencing at the time. So I would always appreciate that gentleman's response, because at first I was like, yeah, whatever. And then when I really started thinking about it, I was like, you know what? A lot of our lived experience is through the perspectives in which we hold at certain things, and it can get really easy, especially when there's something that's really not going well for us. We can really focus in on that thing and be like, well, this thing sucks. And not focusing on it doesn't make it suck any less, but it just means when we associate this thing with work, it's not gonna hold as much power. It's like, oh yeah, that part of my job don't really love, but there's this other part that I do find really fulfilling or I do find really enjoyable. That for me was a big first step in kind of combating that initial stage of burnout. Also too, taking that rest, I took 2 months unpaid to go not just on a vacation and take time off work, which there's nothing wrong with that. I backpacked for a month, half of it with my father. He actually came out and we backpacked through Vietnam together and slept in caves. Like, it was wild. It was so much fun. And then the other month I did an intensive training course because I wanted to learn a new skill and I wanted to invest back in myself and do something absolutely unrelated to what I was doing for work, but be able to grow and expand on a skill. And that was really, really helpful for me. And maybe your situation, that's totally different and that's not something available to you. There's never, I won't want to say never, but I think taking time off, if it's unpaid and you can financially manage it and plan for it, and I can make a whole other video on that because it was like a year of planning, but if you have the opportunity to do that because you really want to invest in yourself and building a new skill that's not directly related to work, like, it was one of the best decisions that I ever made. And I am so grateful that I took that opportunity for myself, and I wouldn't hesitate to do it again because it was really valuable. Another one when we talk about burnout is reevaluating the boundaries. One of my favorite things, as we know, talking about boundaries, but it really is important because if there's, for example, maybe something that you're really struggling with is the job environment or your manager is not respecting your work and home life balance and they're constantly expecting you to connect and work long hours. Maybe there are boundaries that you have to put in place, not just for yourself, but for the sake of your work. Because the reality is, if you let these things go on for so long and something's burning you out so much, it's gonna get to a point where you're gonna have to physically take time off of work because you're going to be so ill physically and mentally that you're not gonna be able to show up and do your job effectively. And so setting boundaries are actually setting both yourself and the company up for success, because it's saying, I need to do this for myself so that I can show up and do the best work possible for this company, for this role. And so boundaries are in place to benefit both parties. They're not in place for someone to win and someone to massively lose out on. When you think about that in the sentence or the scenario in which I just said, you setting a boundary to say, I can't work 70 hours a week because it's not sustainable long term, and my output towards this company is going to be impacted by that. And potentially long term, I will have to go on leave because I will no longer be able to show up for myself, let alone for this job. And so you're setting things up so that both parties have the best chance of success. And if you struggle with boundaries, I really encourage you to reframe the way you think about them so that they're more of a positive thing. This thing is in place to benefit both people here. This one I know is not everyone's cup of tea, and you've probably heard it a million times, and it works. And I know it works because I've done it. When we talk about mindfulness and meditation and breath work, whatever kind of meditation or mindfulness resonates with you, incorporating these practices into our day-to-day life, for me, has been life-changing. I know it's not everyone's cup of tea. If you haven't tried it, I do encourage you to try it, but it doesn't need to be this overwhelming thing. It's not like, oh, you have to dedicate an hour a day and it's got to be really intense. You have to do it exactly this way. Mindfulness, meditation can look so different for so many people. Meditation can look like going on a walk where you just leave your cell phone in your back pocket. Maybe you don't have any music, maybe you do have music, and you just observe everything around you. Moving meditation, that's all it is. Just going for a 10-minute walk can be maybe how you incorporate that into your life. For others, maybe it's 10, 15 minutes of just stretching. Just really getting in tune with your body, figuring out how it feels to move in your body, stretching your body, and just having that space and time to practice a moving meditation in that sense. Maybe for some, it's just sitting outside with a cup of tea and observing what's going on around you. Like, there's so many different ways we can incorporate things like this that don't need to be this really overwhelming, intimidating thing. And they make such a positive difference over time, especially for someone like me who my brain is constantly racing. And so when I'm having a lot going on at work, on top of what's already going on in my brain, it can feel so overwhelming that sometimes it's like I'm stuck in this like debilitating paralysis of like, there's so much going on and I know I need to do it. I just can't even bring myself to start because it's like a tornado in my head right now and I just need to calm down the storm. And so for me, sitting for 10, 15 minutes, maybe I put on some really calming, relaxing music and just allowing the tornado to happen, but kind of removing myself from it and just observing it, gives myself the space and clarity to slow down, to be like, now I can start doing something. I don't know if anyone else is like that too, but that's really helpful for me. So I would say incorporating some sort of mindfulness, meditation, breath work, however it resonates for you into your day-to-day life, and even within your work days, as taking breaks, can be really, really beneficial. So now we're gonna get into a little bit of recovering from burnout. So this is kind of the place where you know you're burnt out. You are fully in it, and you need to go through this period. It's genuinely like a recovery to try to get back to a point where you're feeling yourself again, you're feeling motivated, you're feeling not burnt out, essentially, is what we're going for here. There's been studies on what untreated burnout can actually do to your body, to your mind. Mental health, of course, is a huge part of our everyday life, but mental health is one thing, and this can actually lead into mental illness when we talk about untreated burnout. So we're getting, diagnosis of depression, anxiety, and how it kind of manifests in our life. As someone who, I don't talk about this a lot online, but I've had, MDD, major depressive disorder, for like as long as I can remember. And so that's just a consistent in my life. I know that I know how to manage it, but I am also aware that when things like burnout start to come up, or I start to think, I think I'm taking steps towards burnout, I'm starting to feel it again, I know that heightens my depression so much more, that I have to be really careful, because then I'm not only dealing with a flare-up of my depression or an episode or whatever you want to call it, a season of depression coming through, I'm also dealing with a lot of the other things that come along with burnout. And that for me is, I've seen it, it's awful. It will wipe me out. It will, it just ruins so many different areas of my life. And it takes so much to pull me out of that I'm so much more sensitive now to anticipating or understanding when burnout might be coming, because I don't want that. I want to take care of myself. I don't want that for my job. I don't want that for my family. I don't want that for my friends. I don't want that for my personal life. But ultimately, I don't want that for me. So untreated burnout can lead to different mental health issues, mental illness, weight fluctuations, appetite fluctuations, headaches, migraines, high cholesterol, that's interesting, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, stomach and gastro problems, muscle joint pain, breathing issues, injuries. I think it's important to understand that untreated burnout does have physical impacts to the body along with mental impacts. And so we want to take care of ourselves and kind of do what we can to mitigate those things from happening in our life, right? Something that always has sat really close to my heart, I think, is I've seen and I've heard so many different stories of people who worked themselves to death, essentially. It was this heightened burnout, essentially, for so much of their career. But they're like, oh, I'll do that when I retire. I'll take care of myself when I retire. I'll whatever when I retire. It's just this period of life I have to get through with all this work and burnout and everything. And then life kind of starts and whatever. And they keep pushing it off and kind of diminishing what's really going on and these signs of burnout. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen, I've heard, I've witnessed the impacts of when people get finally to the destination they've been talking about with this retirement so they can start living and stop experiencing all these negative impacts of burnout in their work and stress and all that, they pass away. It absolutely guts me to my core, but I've seen it. And when people get out of this kind of survival of this fight or flight mode, you're kind of in it to just fight to survive, and then you're out of it, you don't necessarily realize all of the impacts it's had on you physically over the years. Health-wise, you might not be able to enjoy the retirement, the thing you've been working towards your entire life, the thing that in your mind you were promised but you never really were. If you're someone who is constantly making excuses of, well, it's just a busy season, or it's just a season of life, I'll get through it, I don't need to do anything, I don't need to take this seriously. Maybe take it seriously. Just because maybe you stop being burnt out doesn't mean that it won't have those long-term health implications on your physical body and your mental body. And so if you're not taking care of yourself today, how are you expecting to be healthy when it comes to that thing that you keep looking forward to? I hope that you not only think about setting yourself up financially for retirement, you think about setting yourself up physically and mentally for retirement also, which means taking care of yourself to give yourself the best health possible chance, being healthy. And that was the weirdest way of words to spin that. Set yourself up not just financially for retirement. You want to set yourself up in so many other ways as well. So what I thought was really interesting is I was reading results from APA's 2023 Work in America survey, and I know a lot of you reside in the US, and I'm not in the US, I'm in Canada, but I imagine our stats might be quite similar. It includes a bunch of stats pulled from the survey concerning different aspects of mental health in the workplace. 57 respondents indicated experiencing negative impacts because of work-related stress that are sometimes associated with workplace burnout. These were what they were experiencing highly was emotional exhaustion, didn't feel motivated to do their very best, a desire to keep to themselves. So I know for myself when I experience burnout is I start to recoil, I start to draw a distance, which actually does not help you, fun fact, from coworkers, from friends, from family. You start to just kind of retract and be this kind of shell of yourself. The desire to quit is a big one. And like I kind of spoke to earlier, I think when we get in these situations, it feels like, well, quitting would be the easy escape. And sometimes it absolutely is the right direction for you. But as this gentleman was speaking to me and offered me, well, have you tried to change the way you're looking at your work situation or try to restructure it in a way that better suits you before, exploring an alternative? That really kind of rang true to me of, well, yeah, okay, maybe the best option isn't quitting. Because when you're quitting, you don't know what you're going into. You could be going into the same environment. You could be going into a worse environment for you. Lower productivity. Makes total sense when you're burnt out. You just don't have as much in your glass to give. Irritability or anger towards coworkers, customers. Your level of irritability is just so heightened that it takes so much less in order to kind of trigger you in a way that even when you think about it, you're like, that's not me. Like, that's not how I respond to things. That's not how I want to show up. That didn't even feel like me. I've definitely experienced that before, where I respond to something and I'm like, that was not me. That was an indicator to me that something's not going well for me, and I need to take a look internally at kind of what's going on. Feelings of being ineffective. When you're doing stuff, you're constantly feeling like, well, I'm doing things, but I'm not getting anywhere. I'm doing things, but none of this is actually good. So starting to judge our own output. I was trying to find different studies to show, how many people experience burnout, and unanimously across everything I'd found, it was like, well, at some point in everyone's career, they feel it to some degree. Not everyone is a really, really, really severe case, and not everyone is just going to feel it a little bit, but at some point during your career, you're probably going to get faced with a little bit of burnout, whether you recognize it to be burnout or not. And so that gave me comfort, knowing that it's something that a lot of us face and not something isolated to myself. Like I said, it doesn't mean you're weak. It doesn't mean that you're not able to survive the environment that you're in. It's just a reality of the world we live in, and just part of being human is kind of how I look at it. But just because it's part of being human doesn't mean it doesn't deserve attention. It's got a little journey assigned to it. You kind of got to give it the attention that it deserves. What I also thought was interesting, and I actually had the opportunity to sit down with Dr. Vivek Murthy, which is the US Surgeon General, a couple years ago now, and we were talking about the framework for the workplace mental health and well-being, which is heavily tied to burnout. And I'm not going to go super into detail with exactly what that is, but the 5 kind of pillars for what the priorities are right now is protection from harm. So that is the biggest one when it comes to work, because we want to make sure that in the workplace, people are protected from harm, both physically and psychologically. So, safety and security at work is really important. Connection to community, so a sense of belonging and support. So in my content, when we talk about like supportive managers, that comes to mind for me, but you want to feel supported when you're at work. You don't want to feel like this isolated island of, I can't rely on anyone, I can't go anywhere for support, it's me, myself, and I. Like, you want to feel like you're backed by a team, you have people to go to if you need additional support, if you need additional information, if you're looking for some guidance. You want to feel a sense of belonging to something. Like, it doesn't feel good to feel zero connection to the place that you work, whether it's to the product, to the people, to the mission. Like, it's a very isolating feeling when that happens. The third one is work-life harmony. So, getting away from this idea of work-life balance, because when we think about balance, think about a scale, and they're never going to be equal. It's, this work-life integration almost. In certain seasons of life, work is going to take a bigger piece, and other seasons of life, work's going to take a smaller piece, and especially a lot of us have shifted to remote work. There's this different integration now when it comes to work and home life, because it exists in the same 4 walls. And so focus on work-life harmony and how we can kind of work together for that integration. And it's not going to look the same for any 2 individuals, because the reality is my priorities in life are going to be very different than yours, and how much I'm allocating to work in a different season of life versus, family or friends or hobbies or what have you, is just going to look very different than everyone. So you got to kind of look at your picture as a whole and say, how's my work-life harmony? How am I happy with that situation? 4th is mattering at work. So feeling like you provide a sense of meaning with your work itself or your presence within the organization. You want to feel like you matter. And an opportunity for growth, whether that's through different job opportunities, whether that's within your skill set, continued learning. There's got to be some sense of growth. At the beginning of a new job, everything seems overwhelming and you're constantly learning new things. And, at moments it's like, oh my gosh, can I even do this? Like, do I know anything? Everything seems so foreign to me. But as you stay at a job for a bit longer, you start to lose a little bit of that challenge. Maybe you're not being exposed to new skills, and it feels good to learn new things, to be exposed to new things. And so the 5th one being opportunity for growth, I do think is quite important. Wanting growth too doesn't necessarily mean you want to climb the ladder and get to the top and you want to expand your responsibilities. Growth might mean, you just want to learn to use a new system every now and then, just to learn something new and practice the skills of learning and show your brain that you can do it and you can adapt and you can change. And so growth looks different for everyone, but I think to an extent we all require or would like some sort of growth within our working lives. And so those are the 5 pillars, which those are also really important to think about. And there's tons of literature on that as well that goes way into depth on all 5 of them online if you want to go take a peek. So one thing I did find really interesting when I was researching rates of burnout from a bunch of different surveys and respondents is that typically you experience it more, it's more typical to affect women by about 10% more than it is men to experience burnout in the workplace. And there's higher reports of burnout in the younger generations. And a piece of me goes, is that a true statistic, or is it that younger generations are able to identify burnout and they're okay with saying, yeah, I've been burnt out, versus potentially in other generations, it was so stigmatized, not really talked about, seen as a sign of weakness that maybe they have experienced burnout, but they didn't identify with it or just don't want to admit to that. That's where my mind kind of goes when it comes to the stats about women being a bit higher and then the younger generations. I'd be very curious to see kind of more the root of where that really comes from. I know there's so many different contributing factors to younger generations too, of what potentially might add to the conversation for burning them out, but what do you think about that? Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I think one of my favorite things about having these conversations and these longer format videos is that the comment section is full of so much knowledge and different lived experiences, and for the most part is really respectful. Like, even if you disagree with something someone has said or something that I've said, that's totally okay. And I love the way that so many of you structure your comments, your feedback, your conversations, because it's, from what I've seen, like quite respectful of like, hey, I recognize that you've experienced that. I've actually experienced the complete opposite, and you bring so much to the table that it's really interesting to go through, because I learned so much going through it. So many things I read, I'm like, oh, that's a really good point of what could be contributing to this, or like, oh, I never thought of it that way. And so I appreciate everyone who joins the conversation, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on anything burnout related. If you've experienced it, how long it took you to get through, what were the first kind of indicators of maybe I am feeling a little bit burnt out. Did you leave the job? Did you take a break? Did you reshift kind of how you perceive the job? What worked for you? And the last kind of research that I found that I did find quite interesting is nearly 3 in 4 workers across the US, again, this study was based in the US, 3 in 4 have suffered from burnout and the associated symptoms as a result from their current role, like the role that they had at the time of the survey. And so I don't have stats on how long they were at the role, but 3 out of 4 at their existing role is quite a substantial amount. They had put feedback into the survey of what they believe contributed to it. And so the top thing contributing to it was a heavy workload. The next was a lack of resources. Then micromanagement was up there quite high, which is a really interesting one, because we talk about micromanagers a lot within my content, and it can really, really negatively impact a lot of people. And a lot of micromanagers, I mean, some are aware that they do it and some just aren't aware that they do it, but the impact that it has is quite large. Males are more likely to take action following burnout than their female counterparts, which is interesting because from the last study that I was reading, it was saying that females are more likely to experience it. So females are more likely to experience it. This is saying men are more likely to take action about it. Really interesting. Over 2/3 of male workers have considered leaving their current role due to burnout, compared to over half of women. And get this, workers in the agricultural sector are more likely to burn out, followed by those working in finance and insurance. And information publishing and telecommunication was a close third. And this study also showed that workers between the ages of 18 and 24 are most impacted by burnout, with 85% of workers in this age bracket suffering from burnout or one or more of the associated symptoms. And then interestingly enough, in this study, 1 in 8 of workers between the ages of 55 and 64 were unsure of the symptoms of burnout altogether. But just over half of the people in the age bracket in this study claimed to have been impacted by them once they were filled in on what burnout really looked like and how it kind of manifests for you, indicating that they may feel uncomfortable discussing the stresses in the workplace. Absolutely. Anyways, that's all I had kind of prepared to discuss with you today. I know there's so much information out there. If you're looking for different stats and research and studies, the internet's a great place for it. There was so much to kind of go through that maybe you want to look up specifically to where you live in this world. I highly encourage you to do that, to just understand that you're not alone in what you're experiencing or have experienced or might experience in the future. I hope that you found this interesting, comforting, what have you today. I'm really excited about this series because we're going to get into some really interesting things. In our next episode, we're going to talk about bore-out, which I have so many thoughts on and so much experience with, and we're going to get a little deep dive into that. We're going to talk in an episode about when do you know if it's time to leave your job. We're going to get into dealing with difficult coworkers and much more. So if you have a topic that you want to have discussed in this Work Besties Business conversation, please drop it in the comments and let me know, because I'd love to bring all the different topics that you're interested in to the table. I hope I was able to bring you some sort of value today. As always, I appreciate so dearly you being here. So thank you for allowing me to take up a little bit of space and time in your day. And until the next video, toodaloo.